The city breathed its nightly sigh, a long exhalation of distant sirens, the hiss of wet tires on asphalt, and the low, electric hum of neon that painted the streets in streaks of garish color and deep, inky shadow. It was in these shadows, in the liminal space between the closing time of the diner and the true witching hour, that Soledad Vargas found a peculiar sort of peace. The air was cool and carried the scent of rain, diesel, and the faint, greasy perfume of fried food from the vents. To most, it would be unremarkable, a backdrop of urban decay. To Soledad, it was the smell of her independence, hard-won and fiercely protected. Inside, the diner was a relic, a capsule of chrome and faded red vinyl that had stubbornly refused to die. Soledad moved through the familiar ritual of closing with an economy of motion born of repetition. Her hands, capable and strong, wiped down counters already gleaming, stacked chairs with a soft clatter, and guided the mop in long, sweeping arcs across the checkered floor. Each task was a silent promise to herself, a brick laid in the foundation of the new life she was building, far from the sun-bleached memories of Buenos Aires. This was her sanctuary, her battlefield, and her prison, all contained within walls of glass and steel. The final task was the trash, a heavy, odorous bag that she hauled out through the back door into the alley. The air here was sharper, laced with the tang of rotting garbage and damp concrete. She heaved the bag into the dumpster, the metallic crash echoing sharply in the narrow corridor of brick and fire escapes. It was then that the other sounds registered, not as part of the city's usual chorus, but as a discordant note. A sharp, guttural command. The scuff of a shoe against gravel, too deliberate, too frantic. It came from the mouth of the adjacent alley, a darker slit between two older, more foreboding buildings. Curiosity, that fatal human flaw, pricked at her. She should go back inside. Lock the door. This was not her business. But a deeper, more stubborn instinct, the one that had carried her across continents, made her take a silent step forward, pressing herself against the cold, rough brick to peer into the gloom. The scene was stark, almost theatrical in its composition. A tall man in a long, impeccably tailored wool coat stood with his back to her, his posture not of fear, but of a cold, contained fury. He was encircled by two others, their shapes hunched and predatory, their intent radiating from them in waves of palpable menace. This was no simple mugging. The energy was all wrong, too focused, too lethal. Finita, one of the assailants hissed, the words foreign and final. It was over. Soledad's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. Every cell in her body screamed for her to retreat, to become a ghost, to see nothing. But her feet were rooted. She saw the glint of metal as one of the men raised a pistol, the streetlight catching the dull sheen of the barrel. It was aimed squarely at the center of the man in the coat's back. Time did not slow so much as it fractured, each second stretching into a crystalline moment of pure, unadulterated choice. There was no time for a complex moral calculation, no weighing of risks and rewards. There was only the primal, undeniable impulse to act, to intercede, to become a shield against the impending violence. Oih! The word tore from her throat, raw and forceful, a challenge thrown into the tense silence. 3 heads snapped in her direction. The man in the coat turned just enough for her to see a sliver of his profile, a sharp jawline and an eye that held not relief, but a flash of sheer, incandescent fury at her interruption. The gunman, startled, his aim broken, swung his weapon toward the new threat, her. In that fragmented second, Soledad didn't think of herself. She saw only the man, now off balance, and the immediate danger. She launched herself forward, not at the gunman, but at the intended victim, her body a clumsy, human projectile. Her shoulder connected with his solid back, a jarring impact that shoved him sideways toward the dubious shelter of an overflowing dumpster. The world exploded into sound and light. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, a crack that reverberated off the bricks and seemed to suck all the air from the alley. A searing, white-hot pain bloomed in her upper arm, a brand of fire that stole her breath. The force of it spun her, sending her stumbling to her knees on the wet, filthy ground. The coppery smell of her own blood filled her nostrils, thick and cloying. From her vantage point, the world tilted on its axis. She saw dark figures materialize from the shadows of the main street, moving with a silent, terrifying efficiency. There were 2 more sharp, percussive cracks, suppressed and professional. The 2 assailants crumpled to the ground without a sound, their forms becoming still, dark shapes on the asphalt. Then, silence descended, heavier and more profound than the noise that had preceded it. The only sound was the frantic thumping of her own heart in her ears and the distant, indifferent wail of a siren several blocks away. A shadow fell over her. The man she had saved stood above her, his coat now dusted with grime from his fall. He was taller than she had realized, his presence immense, blocking out the distant light. He knelt, his movements fluid and controlled, and his face was no longer a sliver but a whole, a composition of sharp angles and cold, assessing eyes that scanned her, the wound, the scene, with a detached, analytical calm that was more frightening than any display of panic could have been. He reached out, not to comfort her, but to examine the gash on her arm, his fingers surprisingly gentle as they brushed the torn fabric of her waitress uniform, now stained a deep, ugly crimson. His gaze finally lifted from the wound to meet her eyes. In their dark depths, Soledad saw no gratitude, no warmth, no human relief. She saw only a storm of cold fury and a dawning, terrifying realization of the catastrophic complication she had just become. Consciousness returned to Soledad not as a gentle dawn, but as a slow, disorienting tide, pushing her up from the depths of a painless void into a reality that was profoundly, unsettlingly wrong. The first thing she registered was the absence of smell. There was no sharp tang of antiseptic, no bleach-clean scent of hospital linen, no lingering ghost of fried food from her uniform. Instead, the air was still and faintly perfumed with lemon and beeswax. The surface beneath her was impossibly soft, the sheets a high thread count that whispered against her skin, a stark contrast to the crisp, utilitarian cotton she expected. And the light was wrong. It wasn't the harsh, fluorescent glare of an emergency room, but a soft, golden glow filtering through heavy, floor-to-ceiling drapes drawn against the outside world. She tried to sit up, a jolt of fire lancing through her left arm, the memory of the alley crashing back with the force of a physical blow. The gunshot. The man. The cold fury in his eyes. Her breath hitched as she looked down. She was wearing a simple, elegant silk nightgown that was not her own. The wound on her arm was expertly bandaged, a neat, professional wrap of white gauze stark against her skin. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of her consciousness. This was not a hospital. This was a bedroom, but a bedroom of a scale and opulence she had only ever seen in films. The ceiling was high, adorned with intricate molding. The furniture was dark, heavy wood, antique and solid. A single, massive painting of a storm-tossed sea hung on one wall, the colors deep and brooding. The door opened without a sound, and the man from the alley entered. He had shed the wool coat, revealing a tailored black suit that fit his broad shoulders with a precision that spoke of immense wealth and power. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace, filling the spacious room with his presence. He was even more imposing in the light, his features sharper, his dark eyes missing nothing as they scanned her face, taking in her confusion, her fear. "You are awake," he said. His voice was a low baritone, calm and measured, devoid of the panic or relief that should have colored such a statement. "The doctor has been and gone. The bullet only grazed you. You were fortunate." "Where am I?" Soledad's voice was a rasp, her throat dry. "I need to go home." "This is your home, for now," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. He walked to a mahogany sideboard and poured a glass of water from a crystal carafe, bringing it to her. The gesture was one of civility, but it felt like a ritual, a performance. "My name is Marcello Rossi. The men in the alley, they were not common thieves. The situation is complex." The name meant nothing to her. She took the water, her hand trembling slightly. "I don't care who they were. I want to go home." Marcello Rossi studied her, his head tilted slightly. He seemed to be weighing something, deciding how much of the truth to dispense. "The people who shot at me," he began, his words deliberate, "they are part of a rival organization. They now know your face. They know you intervened. Your apartment, your place of work, they are no longer safe for you. To send you back there would be to sign your death warrant." The words landed with the force of a physical blow, the air leaving her lungs. This couldn't be happening. She had acted on an impulse, a stupid, noble impulse, and it had pulled her out of her own life and into some dark, alternate reality. "Who are you?" she whispered, the question laden with a new, dawning horror. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The newspapers, when they are brave enough to print it, call me the Oak. I am the head of the Rossi family." The Rossi family. The words hung in the perfumed air, their meaning slowly crystallizing. It wasn't just a name, it was a title. It was a history written in blood and silence. The Mafia. She had thrown herself in front of a bullet for a mafia boss. The sheer, catastrophic irony of it threatened to swallow her whole. Her act of random kindness had not saved a life, it had entangled her in a war. "You are my guest," Marcello continued, the word guest feeling like a euphemism for something far more permanent. "You will remain here, under my protection, until the threat is neutralized. My men are securing the situation. It is the only way to ensure your safety. It is a debt of honor." A debt of honor. She was a prisoner, a living, breathing IOU in a world where debts were settled in ways she couldn't imagine. She looked from his impassive face to the luxurious prison surrounding her, the silk sheets, the antique furniture, the silent, watchful door. The gash on her arm throbbed, a constant, painful reminder that the world outside these walls wanted her dead, and the men standing before her, her reluctant jailer, was the only thing standing between her and that fate. The gilded cage had snapped shut, and she was trapped inside, the cost of her own humanity, a freedom she may never see again. The first few days in the penthouse unfolded with the eerie, suspended quality of a dream. Soledad was a ghost in a palace of marble and silence. Her world, once defined by the clatter of dishes and the frantic pace of a double shift, had shrunk to a series of opulent rooms, each one a testament to a life of power and profound isolation. The silence was the most oppressive part. It was a heavy, manufactured quiet, broken only by the soft, rhythmic tread of the guards posted at the main door and the distant, muted hum of the city far below, a world she could see through the panoramic windows but could no longer touch. She was a specimen under glass, preserved for her own safety, her existence now a problem to be managed. Her interactions with Marcello were brief, formal, and conducted under the watchful eyes of his men. He would check on her each evening, a ritual as structured as a business meeting. He would ask about her arm, his tone clinical, and she would offer a terse, one-word answer. He was always impeccably dressed, a figure of unassailable authority, his emotions locked away behind a mask of cool civility. She, in turn, met his gaze with a simmering defiance, her pride a small, flickering flame in the gale of her circumstances. She was his inconvenient obligation, a living reminder of a moment of vulnerability, and she felt the weight of that resentment in every measured word he spoke. The turning point, the crack in the flawless facade, arrived on the fifth night. A silent, severe woman had brought her dinner on a silver tray, a perfectly seared piece of fish, steamed vegetables, food that was elegant, nutritious, and utterly devoid of soul. It was the third such meal in a row, and something inside Soledad finally snapped. It wasn't just the food, it was the totality of her powerlessness. When Marcello made his customary evening appearance, standing in the doorway of her room like a warden, she was waiting for him. "The food," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "It's bland. It's all, perfect and dead. I'm not one of your paintings, Marcello. I need real food." He paused, one hand in his pocket, his expression unreadable. "The chef prepares what is nutritionally optimal for your recovery." "I don't care," she fired back, crossing her arms and wincing at the pull in her injured arm. "I'm from Buenos Aires. I need spice. I need flavor. I need an empanada that tastes like something, or a steak, for God's sake, not this whisper on a plate." She was being unreasonable, she knew it, but the rebellion felt good. It was an assertion of self, a demand to be seen as more than a problem. A long moment of silence stretched between them. She expected dismissal, a cold reminder of her position. Instead, a faint, almost imperceptible light flickered in the depths of his dark eyes. It might have been amusement. It might have been annoyance. "What would you have?" he asked, his tone neutral. Surprised by the opening, she didn't hesitate. "Ají de gallina. Can your chef manage that? It's Peruvian, but we make it at home. It's chicken in a yellow chili sauce. With rice. And it should have a kick." He studied her, his gaze intense, as if he were seeing past the angry woman and into the person who missed her home, who defined herself by the tastes and smells of a life he had forcibly removed her from. He gave a single, slow nod. "I will see what can be done." The following evening, the meal was different. The silver tray carried a plate bearing a vibrant, yellow stew, a bowl of fluffy white rice, and a small, fierce-looking extra pot of sauce on the side. When Marcello entered, he didn't linger in the doorway. He walked to the small table by the window where she sat and pulled out the chair opposite her, sitting down without invitation. He watched as she took the first tentative bite. The flavors exploded on her tongue, the creamy, spicy sauce, the tender chicken, the familiar comfort of it all. It was a taste of her own world, here, in the heart of his. A small, involuntary sound of pleasure escaped her. "It's good," she conceded, her defiance softening into something more complex. "It is from a place my mother favored," he said, his voice quieter now, less the Don and more just a men. She had a taste for louder flavors as well. It was the first personal thing he had ever shared. The mention of his mother, a figure from a past that seemed as distant and mythical as his present was formidable, created a tiny bridge between them. He didn't leave. He sat there, in the growing twilight, as she ate. He didn't speak of business, or threats, or her confinement. He asked her, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room, about Buenos Aires. He asked about the diner. He asked why she had shouted, why she had moved, in that alley. And so, she told him. The words came haltingly at first, then in a steady stream. She spoke of the bone-deep weariness of her shifts, of the stubborn dream of art school that felt a million miles away, of the simple, unthinking impulse that had propelled her forward. She spoke of her life not as a tragedy, but as a work in progress, a thing she was building with her own two hands. He listened, truly listened, his focus entirely on her, his formidable presence now a quiet audience for her story. When she finished, the room was dark, the city below them a sprawling tapestry of lights. He was silent for a long time. "I have not had to trust a stranger in a very long time, Soledad," he said, her name on his lips sounding like a confession. "In my world, trust is a currency spent carefully, and often, it is counterfeit. What you did, it was a currency I no longer recognized." He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. The admission was more profound. The charged space between them was no longer filled solely with tension and fear, but with a new, dangerous current of understanding. The gilded cage was still a cage, but the men who held the key had, for the first time, allowed her to see the men behind the lock. The fragile truce that had blossomed over a shared meal and quiet conversation did not erase the fundamental reality of Soledad's confinement, but it did change its texture. The penthouse no longer felt like a sterile, luxurious prison, but rather a stage upon which a strange, intimate dance was being performed. Marcello's evening visits became less of an obligation and more of a ritual. He no longer stood formally in the doorway, he would enter, sometimes with a book of Italian poetry he thought she might find interesting, other times simply to stand with her at the vast window, looking down at the city that pulsed with a life she was still denied. They spoke of art, of the sea in his painting, of the dusty, sun-drenched plazas of her memory. He was still the oak, a man of immense and unspoken power, but with her, in these stolen hours, the bark seemed to soften, allowing glimpses of the men within. This new normalcy was a delicate illusion, and it was shattered with brutal efficiency one evening. They were in the main living area, Marcello pouring 2 glasses of a rich, dark Amarone. The moment was calm, almost domestic. Soledad was just reaching for her glass when the world outside the windows erupted. Not in sound, for the glass was impenetrably thick, but in light, a sudden, violent bloom of orange and yellow that flared against the neighboring building, followed by a shockwave that hit the penthouse with a deep, unsettling thrum that vibrated through the very floor. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into a darkness punctuated only by the emergency strips along the floor and the infernal glow from outside. Before Soledad could even process the scream caught in her throat, Marcello was on her. His glass shattered on the marble floor, a spray of red like blood. He didn't speak. He moved with an animalistic speed that was terrifying. One arm hooked around her waist, yanking her from the couch with irresistible force, while his other hand, large and unyielding, cradled the back of her head, pressing her face into the rough wool of his suit jacket. He was a fortress of muscle and intent, his body curving around hers, shielding her completely as he half-carried, half-dragged her across the room. Shouts erupted from the hallway, the sound of running feet, the crisp, professional commands of his men. A staccato rhythm of suppressed gunfire chattered from somewhere beyond the main door, a sound like angry hornets. Soledad trembled, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the smell of his cologne and the faint, clean scent of wool filling her senses. He was murmuring in Italian, low, guttural words she couldn't understand, but the tone was not one of panic. It was a mantra of protection, a fierce, possessive incantation. He shoved her down behind the solid, immense bulk of a steel-reinforced desk, his body remaining as a living barricade between her and the door, his head raised, listening, assessing the threat with a chilling calm even as his grip on her was bruisingly tight. The firefight beyond the door was short, brutal, and efficient. Within a minute, the gunfire ceased, replaced by the sound of tense, low voices reporting the situation clear. The immediate danger had passed. The lights flickered back on, harsh and revealing. Slowly, Marcello's grip loosened. He pulled back just enough to look down at her, his hands moving to her shoulders. His face was a mask of controlled fury, but his eyes were wild, dilated, burning with a raw, unchecked emotion that had nothing to do with the strategic calculations of a Don and everything to do with the primal terror of a man who had almost lost something precious. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice a ragged scrape. His gaze scanned her frantically, his thumb stroking over her shoulders in a gesture that was anything but gentle, a physical reassurance that she was whole, that she was alive. She could only shake her head, her own breath coming in shallow gasps. The air between them was electric, thick with the residue of adrenaline and a truth that could no longer be contained. The careful distance, the civilized conversations, the unspoken rules, they had all been incinerated in that blast. All that was left was this, her, him, and the terrifying knowledge that his protection was no longer a matter of honor, but of something far more personal, far more desperate. He saw the understanding in her eyes, the dawning realization of what his frantic, possessive shielding truly meant. A low sound, almost a growl, escaped him. He framed her face with his hands, his touch suddenly, shockingly tender against the violence of moments before. "Soledad," he breathed, and her name was a prayer, a curse, a surrender. Then his mouth was on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a claiming, an explosion of all the tension, fear, and forbidden attraction that had been simmering between them since the alley. It was desperate and hungry, a violent affirmation of life in the face of death. She didn't resist. She met his ferocity with her own, her hands tangling in the lapels of his ruined suit, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in her shattered world. In that kiss, the last of his walls crumbled, and the oak finally fell, not to an axe, but to the relentless, quiet strength of the woman who had, without ever meaning to, taken root in the cracks of his stone-hearted world. The morning after the attack, after the kiss that had shattered the last pretense between them, dawned with a cold, clinical clarity. The penthouse, once a gilded cage, now felt like the aftermath of a storm. The broken glass had been swept away, the scent of smoke and cordite purged by the silent, efficient staff, but the air still thrummed with the memory of violence and the seismic shift their intimacy had caused. Marcello was gone when Soledad awoke, the space beside her in the vast bed cool and empty. A part of her, the pragmatic waitress from Buenos Aires, braced for the inevitable retreat. He was a Don, after all. Men like him did not have their lives appended by a waitress. They settled debts, they did not build futures on them. He found her later, standing once more at the great window, watching the city begin its day, a world that felt more distant than ever. He was dressed not in a suit, but in dark, tailored trousers and a simple black sweater, the absence of his armor making him seem both more approachable and more dangerously real. His expression was unreadable, the mask of the oak firmly back in place. "The situation has been resolved," he stated, his voice devoid of the raw emotion of the previous night. It was the Don speaking now, the strategist. "The Rossetti faction responsible is no longer a threat. The path is clear." Soledad's heart sank, a heavy stone in her chest. This was it. The dismissal. The payment for services rendered. She wrapped her arms around herself, turning from the window to face him, her own mask of defiance slipping back into place. "Good. Then I can go." He didn't respond immediately. He simply watched her, his dark eyes tracing the line of her shoulders, the stubborn set of her jaw. "I have arranged for everything," he continued, his tone still impossibly even. "A new identity. Papers. An account in Zurich that will ensure you never have to work another day in your life. A flight to anywhere in the world you wish to go. You will be safe. The debt is paid." The words were like a series of precise, surgical cuts, severing her from his world with a brutal finality. He was offering her freedom, the very thing she had craved, but it felt like a life sentence to a different kind of prison, one of loneliness and memory. She had seen the men behind the myth, had felt the crack in his foundation, and now he was calmly bricking it back up. Anger, hot and sharp, flared through her, a welcome antidote to the crushing pain. Is that what last night was? She asked, her voice trembling with a fury she made no effort to conceal. A final settlement? You don't get to save me and then just send me away with a suitcase full of blood money, Marcello. Not after everything. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face, not anger, but a profound, weary impatience. What would you have me do, Soledad? He asked, the Don's composure fraying at the edges. Ask you to stay? To live in this world? To look over your shoulder every day for the rest of your life? You have no idea what you are asking for. I'm not asking for anything, she shot back, stepping toward him. I am telling you that you don't get to make this choice for me. You talk of honor, but this isn't honor. This is you being a coward. You're afraid. The word hung in the air between them, charged and dangerous. Coward. A word no one had ever dared breathe in his presence. His eyes narrowed, the air around him seeming to grow cold. Careful, he warned, his voice a low growl. But she was beyond caution. You're afraid of what this is. You're afraid because you can't control it. You can control your men, your business, your enemies, but you can't control this. So your solution is to cut it out, to send it away. That's not strength, Marcello. That's fear. She saw the moment her words struck their mark, a visceral flinch that he couldn't quite suppress. The mask shattered. The oak splintered. He closed the distance between them in 2 swift strides, his hands gripping her arms, not to hurt her, but as if she were the only solid thing in a world suddenly tilting on its axis. You think I am not afraid? He rasped, his voice raw, stripped bare of all its power and pretense. I have faced men with guns and knives and not felt a fraction of the terror I felt last night, holding you, knowing a piece of glass, a stray bullet. I have built my life on being a rock, an island. I thought my heart was stone, Soledad. You made it beat. And that is the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. The confession was torn from him, a raw, aching truth that filled the space between them. He was not offering her a transaction anymore. He was offering her his vulnerability, the one thing he had sworn never to give anyone. So do not speak to me of fear, he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. I am terrified. But I am more terrified of a world where I never see you again. I am not asking you to stay in my world. I am asking you. I am begging you, to let me into yours. The choice was no longer his to make. It was hers. The power had shifted, irrevocably and completely. She looked up at him, at the men who was both a king and a supplicant, and saw not a Don, but the men who had shielded her with his own body, who had kissed her like she was his only source of air. My world is messy, she said softly, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It's loud, and it smells like fried food, and it's complicated. A genuine smile, small and breathtakingly real, touched his lips for the first time. I have spent my life in silence, Soledad. I am ready for the noise. And in that moment, the cage door swung open, not to release her, but to invite him in. The debt was not paid, it was transformed, becoming the foundation upon which something new, and dangerous, and utterly real, could finally begin. Did Soledad and Marcello's story capture your heart? Their dangerous world is only just beginning. If you crave more tales of fierce love and the shadows it conquers, subscribe to the channel for your next epic romance fix.